Hey y'all, welcome to this episode of Black Beat Podcast, where we try to stay unapologetically black. Voices, victories, and shaping our community from the inside out. Hey, I'm your host, John Washington, and CEO of Flossin Media. And today's conversation is one of truly bridging generations and leaderships and legacy. Before we dive in, we want to give a huge thanks to our proud sponsors, Care Oregon, because we're better together. The University of Oregon, a great city deserves a great public university, and the Oregon Health Authority, committed to building a healthier Oregon for everyone. Our honored guest today is none other than Michael Alexander, a powerhouse of Portland civic and nonprofit landscape with a decade of leadership experience across sectors. With health equity and education and economic development, Michael's journey reflects a life dedicated to advancing justice and opportunity for all. So welcome, Mike, to this episode of Black Beat Podcast, man. I'm honored to have you in the house today.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, humbled to be here.
Yeah,
but
that makes both.
Thank you for having me.
Both of us, man. So, Mike, man, let's just get right into this, bro, because I really just. The honor is mine in its sense of just, man, of all the work and contribution over the years that you've put into this marketplace in the Portland area. But, man, let me back up a little bit, man. I'd like to know a little bit more about where you come from, man, and what was the foundation of all of this, that have incentivized you to get into this landscape and do some of the improvements and shaping and all that. Well, what motivated all? Man, tell me about where you from, man.
Well, I'm glad this is a podcast because people can't see me grinning. But, I tell people when they ask me who I am, I tell them I'm a corner brother from Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn, New York. That's who I am. I grew up in the neighborhood there, in the hood in Bed-Stuy. My dad is from the Caribbean. My mother is from the Deep South. So my brothers and I had this wonderful family environment where the cultures of two different places, distinctly different populations, were blended. And, it was a reminder. My father was somebody where everybody who did anything looked like him. Man. And that's how we grew up. Man. My mother was from the Deep South during the heyday of segregation, lynching. And she said, understand who you are, but also understand where you are, because that can change from time to time. So Emmett Till, I go back to that day, and she said, you can't be a wise-mouthed little guy going down to that rural county in Virginia.
Boy, tell me about it.
Yeah.
Georgia wasn't no joke, boy.
Couldn't come back. But I have two brothers. Both of them are kind of MBAs. I'm the social worker.
Yeah.
And I think from the time that I grew up, John, I always had this sense that there was an obligation and an opportunity to create a path, not only for me and my kids, but for everybody who looked like me.
Was that natural inside of you, Mike, or was that something shaped that inside of you?
I'd like to think it was both. I can't lay claim to sort of saying that I created this inner drive, but I also saw people around me. When I was 17 years old, I was handing out brochures for Shirley Chisholm in Brooklyn. I was there when Robert Kennedy established Restoration Corporation in Bedford-Stuyvesant, one of the first economic development initiatives in an inner city neighborhood. I had the opportunity to lead a corporate foundation in my late 30s when I was working for Aetna. And Arthur Ashe was my first chair. So I had these folks around me who sort of made the case that our obligations are to ourselves and to others. And I've always tried to take that wherever I've gone. And John, you and I have shared this. This is my 8th city in 40 years that I've lived in. And it is a unique one, and it is one where I could bring those values and have them accepted and embraced within the city, and particularly within our community.
What got you to Portland, Mike? What was
I was in St. Louis working for a behavioral health firm. My first 10 years of my postgraduate study was spent in community mental health, largely working with inner city youth populations in Philadelphia and New Jersey. Moved around quite a bit, but I ended up in St. Louis. And I had a good friend who came here to join the management team at Regents, Blue Cross Blue Shield. And he reached out to me and said, there's a reorganization going on here. There might be a role for you. Would you be interested? And, in all candor, John, and you and I have talked, I wasn't a fan of St. Louis.
Yeah.
I just
the
never.
golden arches, it was definitely some boyhood.
Between East St. Louis and St. Louis.
Boy, I drive you crazy, boy.
I just never took to it. And, he said there might be something here. And I said, well, I think I'll apply for it. And my family are all back east. They're in New York and New Jersey. And they said, are there any black folks in Portland?
Oh.
And I said, I don't know. I mean, I had no sense of the community here. But when I arrived, I was just absolutely blown away by the history, the resiliency, the challenges that this community has faced in Oregon that were so different than any other place that I've lived.
Yeah.
And that has been something that I think has been constant over my roughly 20 years here.
Hey, Mike, man, I've always noticed, man, that, over the periods of time when we've touched base, man, you've always had that mellow demeanor. Well, and coming out of Bed-Stuy, I find that hard to believe that was a naturally implanted piece.
Well, I was a runner, John.
That's what that was, a long-distance runner.
I was able to get away from it more than anything else. But
Yeah. So did you have a more of a practice when you got here that was already had you rooted in the soil and, in your demeanor and posture? What shaped who this guy is today? And for those who are listening, and who may know, Mike, is that he has this mild demeanor, but there's something in him that he got a stick in his back pocket somewhere, but how tell us, man, how'd you arrive to the disposition which most people acknowledge you and notice you for?
It's an interesting question, and I've been asked it quite a bit, and I think a part of it just had to do with understanding that I needed to be able to be as comfortable as I could be, but I also needed to surround myself with people who were very different than I am. I tell folks all the time, when you go to war, you need a negotiator and you need a SWAT team. And I mean, it's important. You cannot optimize that charge and that responsibility unless you're prepared to sort of operate within those bookends. I view myself in some ways as the negotiator. I try to build where I can build, but I also understand that there are times that you have to burn.
Yeah.
But I also want to have people around me who are able to do that with the same authenticity that I can come to finding some alignment with. I learned a long time ago that there are very few absolute truths, very few. There's some degree of alignment in any position that people take and some degree of sort of diffusion. And we have to find how do we build on those we can build on, and quite frankly, how do we separate from those that we can't.
Gotcha.
But I want to be around people who will help me to do that and understand that, I think my gift is trying to listen deeply and to understand the opportunity to identify areas of compliance, agreement, alignment, but also to honor those where we, quite frankly, are not going to be on the same page. And we need to be able to speak to those with the same truth that we speak to the things that we believe.
So was that transition, Mike, when you was in the mental health world, and then at some point in time you became the CEO of the Urban League? What was that experience like, and how did that transition? What was that transition like from where you were coming from the mental health side into, or was it much of a transition?
It was a thoughtful and intentional one for me, John. I mentioned that I grew up in Bed-Stuy and was involved in a number of kind of community-based activities, particularly in the work that Representative Chisholm was doing. But I also, my first two jobs, coming out of high school and coming out of college, was through the Urban League in New York City, the Urban League of Brooklyn and the Urban League of Manhattan.
Yeah.
The first job that I got, they got me a job as a lifeguard. working for the New York City Parks Department. And that was when I was coming out of high school, raising money for college tuition. I mean, it was a great gig. I worked up in Mount Morris Park in Harlem.
Right on.
It was just a great, great gig.
Yeah.
And then I went to college, and when I came home, my first job was working for Aetna. And again, I got this through the Urban League, and I was a claims adjuster. And those were the folks who went in and investigated.
Yeah, I can see what his disposition would probably come in handy.
Yeah. And they were hiring, young brothers to go into Bed-Stuy and Harlem and interview people because nobody else wanted to do it. But I felt this obligation to the league because they were able to sort of put me on a path of personal growth and development. Now, I ended up going to graduate school after that and getting a degree in psychiatric social work, but I always had this sense of beholding to the league. And when I worked at Regents, I decided to retire at 62. But I had some juice in the tank. I knew I did.
Yeah.
And I wanted to end my career where I started it. And I wanted to end it in community, and I wanted to end it with somebody who had played a role, who put fingerprints on my life, and that was the league.
Gotcha. So what were some of the challenging times, Mike, and the highlights, man, when you look back at the transition and before we get into the real highlights, I mean, but in that interim, what were some of the challenges, man, when you were, in your young age and you were motivated to continue to try to put your footprint into the world? I mean, what were some of your challenges at that time, Mike?
Well, I think, John, one of the challenges has always been, and I mentioned moving around quite a bit, but I always had to find my community wherever I moved to. I went to college in Chicago, graduate school in Philadelphia, worked in Hartford, in Atlanta, in Richmond, in St. Louis, and D.C. And each time I moved, most of the time it was without my family. And so there was a need to find, how do I connect, who do I connect with? And being willing to sort of make that a very intentional part of my being able to be a part of a new community. That was always a struggle for me. I think for better or for worse, the challenges that we face as black folks doesn't change by zip code, doesn't change by state.
Tell me about it.
I mean, it is the same thing no matter where we go. Now, there are different shades and different grades of it, but it doesn't change.
Yeah.
And that piece of it was far too familiar for me. But, I think one of the greatest pieces of advice that I ever got was from a mentor who said, no matter where you go, find a way to do what you believe in. Find a place and a space where you can do what you believe in, because then you'll come to it whole. And I've tried to do that. And Portland has been a very challenging but also rewarding environment for me personally. I've never been as welcomed and as invited to be a part of a community as I have in the 18 years since I've been here.
Wow, man. So after the league, was it a semi-retirement?
Yeah.
What woke you up? I mean, because I remember you said you was going home to lay down for a little while,
Yeah, I laid down for about a year, and then I accepted a position as the interim director of global diversity and inclusion at PSU.
Wow. Yeah, I remember. I remember that, where your office was downtown in the middle building. Yeah. You was rubbing elbows with the muckety mucks.
Well, yeah, I'd like to think so, but I had, and literally it was strange. My office when I was at Blue Cross Blue Shield was at 3rd and Market, and then when I went back to PSU, the office was at 4th and Market. So I could look out the window and literally see the two buildings that I had spent the part of my career in. But that work at PSU was really enlightening in a lot of different ways. The work at the League was just a wonderful way to have a line of sight into all of the dimensions of our community.
Interesting.
All of the dimensions. It's where our affiliation and association began as well.
What did you see, Mike? What were some of the characteristics and trends or trademarks or whatever it was that you saw in the, at least for our community, the black community, what was it that you saw that was uniquely in its own right here at Oregon's, and or was it not unique? Maybe was it similar to any other place you've been where black folk lived and gathered and did all the things that we do?
I think, it's interesting, John. There were similarities and disparities. The similarities that I think our community faces, you find them wherever you go.
Yeah, man.
We're put into a corner,
Yeah.
and somebody says, "Go live there, get out of a line
Yeah.
of sight," and we build community.
Yeah.
I mean, we do that.
Yeah.
But here, the history, the challenges, sort of the position that the state had taken historically regarding
24
black
hours,
folks,
sundown laws,
sundown,
all that.
lash
yeah,
laws.
get your ass up out of here, boy.
Don't the fact that we were not aligned with the Confederacy, don't let that confuse you with thinking that we want you. We don't. And the challenges that this community faced were different than the challenges in Mississippi or the challenges in Detroit. But one of the things that I found was so rich was that the culture here is such a blend. And a lot of it was stimulated through the mass migration here during World War II. Right. So, if you go to some of the other places in the Deep South, our history goes back 100 years. Here it goes back 5, 6, 7 decades if you begin to think about it. And the infusion of the cultures from Arkansas, from Texas, from Louisiana, from North Carolina, it's so relatively new when you begin to think about other geographic areas.
Yeah, especially that east.
And, so when you think about our celebration, our joy, our foods, our cultures, our educational pathways, where people have originated from, some of that, the fabric of that is so different than any other place that I've lived. And it's been rich. It's forced you to sort of understand who you are and where you are, but more importantly, where you came from and how that contributes to who we are right now. And that is so unique here.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree, Mike. It's a spiritual place.
It is.
Unlike in other places, man. And I don't know if it's the fact that Bigfoot still lives here or anything like that. But I think, but for the most part, for me, it was the greenery, the trees, the volcanic movement. And they asked me along, well, why you stay in that Oregon place still? You still there? I said, yeah. And they said, well, why? I said, well, this is probably, other than Hawaii, one of the few places left where new land is still being made.
You got
because we got volcanoes and all that, so some new stuff is going on here.
In a torturous way, but you're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
Hey, Mike, before I transition, man, there's usually, as I speak to you, and very few people I do this exercise with, something I picked up when I was in the East and in Bangkok, and some of the lamas had taught me a little bit something about transition and death and life and those types of. So there's 3 questions I generally ask, and I'm not sure if I ever asked you these questions, but these 3 questions are rooted simple. They're kind of simple, and a simple response. Speak to me about life, speak to me about death, and speak to me about love. Speak to me about life, Mike.
John, as I'm given the opportunity to understand it over a longer period of time, I've come to really appreciate what it means to have the gift of challenge and struggle, the gift, because we are given. I remember a few years ago, Abel Gordon recommended a book to me, the Book of Love, and it was a combination of a discussion between Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama.
Wow.
I mean, it was just rich, and they sort of just talked about, we don't live in a perfect world, but how do you face this, and how do you struggle with that? And I remember the Dalai Lama saying, every day we wake up to a world where our Creator has given us everything that we need, and we spend most of our waking hours tearing it apart. I want to be about the work of acknowledging, embracing, worshiping, and aligning that in my life. So when I think about struggle and challenge, it is a way to sort of connect with that richness, that bounty that our life is meant to embrace and to hold on to. And the distance to that is much greater for our people than it is for others. And so I try to stay in that. So when I think about life, it's not the things that go well, it's the things that we have the opportunity to make go well.
Speak to me about death, Mike.
I'm still trying to find a place that is comfortable and reassuring for me about transition. I think as I was younger, one, I didn't think, I was invincible and I wasn't worried about it. But, I'm 75 now. And as I told you, I wake up every day grateful to be able to wake up in the world that I went to sleep in the night before. There are a couple of things that I'd like to be able to have embraced via death. One is an acknowledgement on the part of my children that I created a path in life for them that is, it warrants the gift that their life has given me. I mean, that is worthy of what I've received and what I've been able to take from my parents. I worry about whether I have spiritually prepared myself to be in this state of transition. I unfortunately, I tell people you will never be able to know where I am on Sunday because I'm in a building. I'm in a mindset, but I'm not in a building. And so my faith community is a very small one. I mean, it's a very personal one. And I don't know that I've taken full advantage of what's available to me in that respect. So I do worry that, death will mean something less to me than it needs to be. When I was younger, I used to say I don't fear it. But as I get older, I have to say that I'm not inviting it. My health is important. Quality of life is important. And it's not to put it off forever, but it's to make sure that I spend every waking moment living and none of it just existing. And I, we see too much of what it means when the brain cells stop working together and when we don't recognize the people we love, or when a condition, a chronic condition, is not something we live with, but something we die from. And I'm trying to sort of find a place where I can just reconcile myself that I'm not asked to do anything that everybody who preceded me on the face of the earth hasn't had to do.
Speak to me about love, Mike.
It is the it is the commodity that gives us our greatest hope. For me, it gives me my greatest hope. I think that I truly understand what it means to think about putting someone in a place and a regard in your life that transcends you. I tell, my wife and I will be celebrating our 10th anniversary in a couple of months. And I tell people that as challenging as COVID was, I'm grateful for the fact that it gave us the opportunity to spend so much time together. And I just fell in love with my wife all over again. But it just reminded me of what it means to have that dimension be a part of what defines you and the world that you live in, and how we have the opportunity to grow that circle of people who we engage in a loving way, of people who we're willing to give entry to what I call a zone of forgiveness. If we can forgive, if we can embrace change, if we can love in a very authentic way that says, I accept your truth for your truth, and I hope that you can accept mine for mine.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay.
That's the joy of that dance, isn't it,
Yes,
Mike?
it
You know,
is.
honoring each other's truth. Well, thank you for that, Mike. And for me, it's sort of a grounding reality, because as we make this transition, and I think it was said to me once before that the best part of your life is in front of you. And so as you transitioned out of the university, you had an opportunity to do some other great work. Also, so tell us how this great work that you're doing now with one of your greatest accomplishments, or one of the greatest contributions you're making to Oregon, is with the Albina Vision Trust. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that, Mike. Give us a little bit of backdrop on that, what you're doing with that, and how that all came out to be, and tell us a little bit about it, because to my understanding is it's one of the greater opportunities that the city of Portland has been able to invite into its space, and some of the changes and growth and opportunities for our communities. So I don't want to rob the foundational understanding of that piece by articulating what my thoughts are about it, but I'd like you to share with us a little bit about what your thoughts are around your participation with the Albina Vision Trust. How'd that come into your scenario?
John, that began initially as a discussion, I'd say back in 2015. I was still at the Urban League, still CEO, and approached by a woman named Zari Sandler, who had been previous Parks Commissioner for the city. And I had sat on the Parks Advisory Board, and she knew me, and she reached out and said, Mayor Hales is interested in bringing together a group of folks just to think out loud about what a new approach to development of, at that point, the Rose Quarter, we referred to it as the Rose Quarter, might look like. And you're familiar that there had been a number of sort of short-lived,
yeah.
The Jumptown and a few others.
Under Larry, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, just to sit down and think about what that effort might be. And, I was fully engaged at the league, and didn't quite know what this meant. And, it sounded as if they would bring together developers, people from the arts, maybe some folks from government and otherwise, just to think out loud. And one of the things that sort of convinced me to sort of take the time to join that was that one of the people who had committed to participating was Rakaya Adams. And that told me that would be time well spent. And so, John, it was probably 20 folks. And again, a lot of them were developers. They were local. There were some folks who were regional. We had
I think I bumped into you on
exactly.
that meeting.
Exactly.
I looked I think it was an architect firm, wasn't it? I looked in the room, and Mike was the only one in there that I knew.
That was it.
Yeah, that was the place, huh? Yeah.
I think Mayor Hales at that point said, the greatest gift I'm going to give you is that I'm going to not have the city get involved in this at all. Yeah. We're just going to have you guys sit down and sort of talk about this. And I think what happened is that. And again, I give great credit to Rakaya. As this discussion began, I used the phrase that people were telling the story from the middle, not the beginning. So they're talking about this area, but there was no acknowledgement of the history. There was no acknowledgement of the disruption. There was no acknowledgement of what had preceded the construction of Veterans Memorial Coliseum or I-5 or the administrative headquarters for the public schools. I mean, it was as if we're going to sort of build going forward without any acknowledgement of who had paid the price to be where we were at that point. And I think, Rakaya and I just said, this story doesn't start here. This story begins 70, 80, 90 years ago. Yeah, man. And we need to understand, and we need to be very intentional in building as we were intentional in destroying. And so that began the initial kind of conversation about what a re-envisioning of this community could look like if we formed around a set of core beliefs. And we had five. We wanted to acknowledge the history. We wanted to be very clear that there was a need to heal. We wanted to leverage some assets. We wanted to use the arts. We wanted to connect to the river. And we wanted something, John, that was going to be remarkable. We were not looking to just sort of put a stamp in the ground that says, okay, there's some redemption here. We can't go back. But the reality is, whatever we did going forward had to be focused, it had to be intentional, and it had to be community-driven. And that was the basis for sort of five of us coming together to say, after that discussion was held, how do we now anchor and root this and make sure that we're going to build a vision for the next 50 years, because the destruction of this community has taken place over the last 50 years.
Yeah.
It has not been immediate. And so I think we were very intentional about being, I use the phrase, uninhibited by reality. We were not restrained by, we don't have any money. We don't, what we have is the ability to sort of envision what this could look like. And we had a set of conditions that were very favorable. This was a potential focus on not only restorative justice, but restorative economics and restorative development. It didn't involve displacement. There are only 66 units of housing within the 95 square acre that we're looking at between the two bridges. So we had the opportunity to build, no demolition. We also had a very small number of owners there. I think a lot of them were public agencies, the city, Metro, Portland Public Schools. And many of the people who occupied this space were in businesses or concerns that were going to undergo a change in their business model over the next several decades. And our challenge was to not be in a position where we witnessed that, but to make ourselves power players so that we could orchestrate it. We wanted to make sure that it was reflective of what we could be based on our aspirations and based on the obligation that this city and this region held to the community that had been displaced.
Right on. And Mike, tell me, was your path, your career path, and the choices you've made over the years and your experiences arrived you to this place? Was there an aha moment of the gift that arrived you to this place? And now here you are, and were you prepared for such an opportunity as this?
John, I'd like to think that everything that I've done up until now, and I've talked about, sort of I've worked corporate, for-profit, nonprofit. I had the opportunity to see leadership and stewardship done well and done poorly. And I tell people all the time, I don't know a lot, I've just seen a lot. I've seen a lot, and I've tried to hold on to those things that I believe would be assets and perspectives that I could bring to a room that would be additive. It's not complete, but additive. And so I think Portland gave me the opportunity to pull all of those threads together and sort of weave the perspective and the fabric that I'd like to bring to it, and understanding. And you and I, we are kindred spirits.
Yeah, man.
In lots of different ways. Lots of different ways.
It's that inside-out reality. That's all right, but we dancing it on the outside, while you dancing it on the inside.
Exactly.
Mike, man, hey, look, man, this interview, man, there are very few of them that I really feel the spiritual aspect of the dialogue as much as I do the information part of the dialogue. And so, man, I have deep gratitude for you to come into this interview and to share you all with our listeners, man. And this interview is in honor of your work and contributions. And so for those listeners, hey, y'all, look, I don't get too much behind the posture of following and all of that, but leadership is a rare quality, but it's earned. It's not a quality that I think everybody is necessarily born with. But Michael, I appreciate the navigation and the leadership that you brought to our community, man, and much respect to you. And man, look here. However you embrace the next opportunity of this life experience, rather if it's getting ready to part or whatever, I'm sure you're going to do well in the dance.
Well, listen, John, I thank you, and I could not leave here without applauding the shadow of leadership that you have cast. And I will tell anyone that you are willing to stand in a crowd or stand alone, but you always stand. And I respect you deeply for that.
Yeah. Respect to you, Mike. Hey, look, this concludes this episode of Black Beat Podcast, brought to you by Cara, Oregon, because we work better together. The University of Oregon, a great city, deserves a great public university. And the Oregon Health Authority, committed to building a healthier Oregon for everybody. Listen here, y'all. We appreciate y'all for taking this moment to listen to this. And this concludes this episode of Black Beat Podcast. We out.